Okay, let's go ahead and get at it. Good evening, or if you're watching this tomorrow morning, good morning. Sure you're getting your day started, and hope you have a productive day and a good weekend. I know you have an exam coming up on Monday, so I know you're super excited about that. And remember, this stuff that we're covering here tonight will not be on that exam, right? So we'll save this stuff for the third exam. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about competition and monopolies. And we're going to be in this chapter for quite some time. This is outline 8. I've got it loaded on Brightspace. I've also loaded a table called Holmes Corporation that we're going to refer to actually tonight for a little bit. But just to kind of set this up a little bit, this is one of the most fascinating areas of economics, at least to me. I've written a lot, frankly, on antitrust in the European Union, and when you think about antitrust law, you're really thinking about the law that really applies to this field of economics. Whether it's the traditional antitrust issues where firms try to gobble up more market share and more power in the market, or really intellectual property issues, which I'm certainly much more familiar with. But this area of economics I find absolutely fascinating, all right? So we're going to look, we're going to start really with pure competition. That's probably about as far as we'll get tonight or tomorrow morning. And then when we come back on Wednesday, we'll spend a little bit more time looking at actual monopolies. But what we're going to do is really kind of see a change. And what I like most about this area of law is you really kind of start out with this area of economics, right? We really start out with looking at pure competition, and then we just kind of shrink it. And I think it's a better way to do it instead of looking at monopolies and then kind of broadening things out. You really look at the way markets are supposed to be, how they're designed, having a lot of competition. And then you really start to see the negative effects of monopolies when we get there, and some of the damage they can do to consumer markets, assuming that they're allowed to take place. Now again, we have a large body of what we call antitrust law to make sure that doesn't happen, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. But again, this is economics. So let's go ahead and talk about really a definition of what is a competitive market. So think about things that you buy every day. Think about how many choices you might have, how many firms provide those goods. So you think of bread, milk. We'll spend a little bit more time with milk. I'm going to use milk as kind of an ongoing example tonight. But think about gas stations, right? How many gas stations can provide you with gasoline for your car? Think about the water company, right? Well, gas stations, you can pretty much go wherever you want to get gasoline, right? And for the most part, the competition is so significant, the prices are roughly the same. So, I can always ask you, what did you pay for gasoline this morning or this week? Things like that. That's different than, where did you buy water, right? The water, generally, you're only going to have one source for water. Right? Now, some of you may have a well at home, and that takes care of that anyway. But, imagine living in the city and you have water service to your home. Chances are there's one water company, and it may be a publicly owned utility. It might be a hybrid. It might be a private utility. How the water gets there could be completely different. Many cities are now selling their water and sewer systems to private firms. All right? So nonetheless, just kind of think of that. Gas stations, you could literally go anywhere, versus water, where you're really only going to have one supplier. Cable television is probably another really good example. I mean, most of us live in areas where there's a monopoly. Some of us might live in areas where you might have two choices, maybe like a Spectrum and an Armstrong or something like that. Okay, now let's go ahead and narrow the scope a little bit and talk about what we would consider to be a perfectly competitive market. And there's really only two requirements. Number one, there are lots of buyers and sellers. And there are so many buyers and sellers that essentially no one buyer and no one seller can actually change the market, right? Nobody has that kind of power. No one firm really has that power. And second, and really kind of a precondition to the first, although the first requirement is kind of more fun to talk about, is that the goods are roughly the same. Okay, and so let's go back to milk, right? Milk is pretty much a standard product everywhere, right? You go into the grocery store or the convenience store or something like that, and you're just going to buy milk, right? You're going to buy most likely a gallon of milk, and I know they make it in different sizes. But milk is pretty much milk. Now, admittedly, there are different types of milk. You can get skim 1%, 2% whole milk, buttermilk if you want something like that. There's probably a couple of chocolate milk. There are probably a couple of other varieties there. But think about milk. There's lots of producers, lots of retail outlets, lots of distributors, lots of producers, lots of consumers, right? Lots and lots of people drink milk. And there really are very few substitutes for milk. And I know there's almond milk or soy juice is really what it is. But nonetheless, really very few alternatives. And milk is such an incredible staple. Okay. Now, when you think about revenue for a firm, now again, all firms want to make money. That's what they're there for, right? P times Q, right? Price times quantity. They want to maximize revenue as much as possible. Now, in this particular area of economics, we're also going to throw in cost. Now, again, in prior chapters, when we were merely looking at revenue, especially with consumer surplus, more so producer surplus, we really weren't factoring in cost too much. Now we're going to start bringing that into the picture. Okay, now, if you will, just briefly, now by the way, I uploaded this on Brightspace, so I will also give you a copy of this when we get to class on Wednesday. But if you look at the Holmes Corporation table, now basically I've given you a quantity of 0 through 8, and I've given you a total revenue table, a total cost table. You get to see where the sweet spot is. So somewhere between 4 and 5 units of milk, that's where this particular firm, the Holmes Corporation, again, certainly fictitious, they maximize their profit, right? And you can see that at 4 and 5 units, they're maximizing profit at 7. That's, by the way, that's per unit. Okay, but if you go to the far right column, you see the change in the profit, and again, separating marginal revenue from cost, basically subtracting marginal cost from marginal revenue. You see at 4 units it's 1, and at 5 units it's 0. And we're going to point that out in the graph and see that's really the sweet spot, right? So where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, that's the sweet spot, right? So MR equals MC. I'm going to throw that on the board here in a second. We'll graph it. That's your sweet spot, okay? And again, this is just kind of a fictitious table, all right? Now, the one thing to keep in mind, right, as we go through this is that when it comes to perfect competition, all right, all firms are price takers, all right, and revenue generally is based on how much you can sell, right? You're going to take the price, whatever the market is. So let's say milk is $6 a gallon, just to make it easy, and it's just kind of what I have in the table. And we're borrowing a lot from, again, Mancu's work. But what you should see here is that really the firms are just taking whatever's in the market. So whether they sell 1,000 gallons or they sell 2,000 gallons, they're going to get $6 per gallon no matter what. All right, so it really doesn't matter. So if the concepts of elasticity and inelasticity are kind of kicking around in your head right now, that's really a good thing. So again, the price is not dependent on quantity, right? So these aren't those traditional curves that we've seen in the past. Okay, so again, just as kind of a make sure I don't trip over my own cord here. You know, let's say, you know, in scenario 1, right, $6 a gallon, right, and let's say you're going to sell, you know, this is really overkill. Quantity is 1,000 units, $6 a gallon times 1,000 gallons, right, and your total revenue is going to be 6,000, right? And remember what total revenue is. It's just, you know, price times quantity. Okay. Now, let's say, for instance, I change this up a little bit and I say scenario 2, in scenario 2, all right, quantity is 2,000, all right? Well, essentially $6 a gallon, little dollar sign there, times 2,000. Total revenue is essentially going to be 12,000. So it really doesn't matter. If it's a perfectly competitive market, none of it's going to matter, right? How much, all right, you're selling. I mean, it'll have a direct relationship to total revenue, but on a per unit basis, this isn't going to matter because you're a price taker, right, in a competitive industry. So again, total revenue, right, in scenario 1 and scenario 2 is proportionate to the quantity, right, that's being sold, right? So in other words, let's just go with some green here, right? If we were to look at, total revenue equals price times quantity, all right, let's go with a little blue here now. Essentially what we're doing is we're holding price constant, and we know if quantity goes up, then total revenue has to go up, and you've seen me do that probably ad nauseum at this point with the arrows and the constant bars and that type of thing. So nonetheless, this doesn't move, right? And what a great multiple choice question, right? If we are in a perfectly competitive market, or which of these three stays constant, it's going to be price. Okay. Now what we're going to do is bring into the mix average revenue and marginal revenue. So let me get rid of this. Okay. All right. So we'll be doing some artwork here today. I'm going to make sure I don't choke myself off here too much. And let me just kind of carry it around a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at average revenue, all right, and average cost. Okay, so just going to get the formulas out here, all right. All right, average revenue, essentially we take the total revenue and divide it by quantity, all right? So pretty simple. All right, now when it comes to marginal revenue, all right? Now, remember, marginal is always based on change, so what we want to do here is just look at the change in total revenue over the change in quantity, okay? Now, one of the things to keep in mind, right, in a perfectly competitive market, okay, and I'll tell you what, let's go with a little blue. We're going to go over here, all right. Average revenue, let me give myself some more space here. I probably should have put it right smack there in the middle, all right. Okay, average revenue is going to equal marginal revenue, okay? And we're going to graph this here in a second, okay? But let's go, I'm going to go this way and kind of break this down just a little bit more so you can see kind of all the components, and here's the reason we're doing this. All right? Everybody agree? Total revenue equals price times quantity, right? And you can kind of imagine where we're headed, okay? Now, again, if you think about, let's just go ahead and do this, right? You can kind of see where we're headed, right? All right, so if I just did some basic algebra, we'll go with brown here, right? Pretty simple, right? Okay, so in the end, right, if we're in a competitive market, we're price takers, right? I don't know if you see the deltas there, but nonetheless, we're really just down to price, right? So if I kind of put it all together here, we got something that looks a little bit like that. Or it actually looks exactly like that. Okay, now, let's talk about profit maximization. So what we're going to do is talk about really two questions. How a competitive market, a firm in a competitive market maximizes profit, and how we develop this supply curve. Now, actually developing the supply curve is pretty easy, right? Actually, it's just going to be your marginal cost curve. Right, so it kind of takes care of itself. So and it'll be a little easy for us. So kind kind of going back to the Holmes Corporation table, I just want to point one thing out. We know where the sweet spot is. It's somewhere between right around 4 and 5 units, and let's just call them each unit's it's a gallon of milk. And we know that profit is maximized somewhere between 4 and 5. All right, that makes sense. Okay. Now, with that said, we're not going to necessarily put in price as $6. We're just going to go ahead and graph a price line. All right, but notice and just kind of keep in mind as we go through this, all right, the marginal revenue is $6, price is $6, right? You kind of see that here, right? Average revenue is $6. So essentially, right, this is probably really overkill, but let's go ahead and do it anyway, right? Average revenue equals marginal revenue equals price, right? And you kind of see that here. I mean, this is just a little overkill, right? Okay, but it's essentially the same thing, okay? So think about that as we go through the graph. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and graph profit maximization for a firm in a competitive market. Let's just go ahead and throw that sucker up there, okay? Okay, so, all right, we'll just kind of put in our origin here, all right, and just, price is always here. Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do is maybe break that down a little bit here. All right, kind of split between cost and revenue. That is essentially price anyway, so we'll go ahead and put this in. All right, now, first thing we're going to do, and imagine this being a straight line. I'm sure it won't turn out that way. There's your marginal cost curve. That turns out to be actually your supply curve, okay? And I'll take a little bit of time here to work this in. Let's go with a little red here. All right, and I'm going to make this a dotted line. All right, I'm going to come up here a little bit and mark it out, okay? Now, this is essentially, this actually has a couple of different names. This is our price line. My E's aren't very good today. All right, and essentially, average revenue, which equals marginal revenue, which equals price. So again, profit maximization for a firm in a competitive market. This is essentially what it looks like, right? But I'm going to dress it up a little bit more, right? This point here at the intersection of where the excuse me, marginal cost and the price line, right, which is essentially average revenue, which equals marginal revenue, which equals price. We're going to call this Q max, right? Okay, so this is the quantity by which we're actually maximizing our profit. Okay, but I want to put in a couple of other things just for argument's sake. Let me go ahead and put in a, it's supposed to be right there. Let's put in a Q1, right? And let's go with a little pink here and bring this sucker out a little bit. And call this Q2, okay? All right, now, a couple other things we want to draw in, and let me go ahead and sneak over here and use a different shade of, all right. Go ahead and get this in here. Okay, somewhere it looks like that. Okay, and this is going to be our average total cost curve, right? Probably looks familiar to you a little bit. Let's get our average variable costs in here somewhere. We'll start here, tuck under a little bit. All right. Average variable cost. All right. Now, by the way, our average, we don't need it. All right, but our Average fixed cost, of course, would be going down. Remember, you're from actually several weeks ago, we were first introducing this stuff. Remember, it's your average total cost, right, that gets pushed up because of your average variable cost, right? Kind of just pulls everything in. Okay. All right. Now, I got a lot of markers there. Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of break this down a little bit. All right. Now, at Q max, this is your sweet spot, all right? So again, at the point where, right, your price line, right, matches your marginal cost curve, right? Well, that's your sweet spot. This is where you want to be, right? Wherever that intersection is. But remember, we're price takers, so your average revenue equals your average revenue equals your price, which also equals your marginal revenue. Right? Okay, now let's talk a little bit about, and by the way, remember that, you know, the average total cost is U-shaped, your average variable cost is U-shaped. You know, if I really wanted to break it down, I think let me go with a darker brown here. You know, if I really, you know, this is your average fixed cost, which remember, decline with quantities and with an increase in quantity. If I can go ahead and keep that over here, just in case we decide to use it later. Okay, so nonetheless, let's talk a little bit about Q1 and talk a little bit about Q2. Now, Q1, all right, essentially, you're kind of underperforming, right? Here at Q1, all right, your marginal revenue, right, is greater than your marginal cost. So what you're going to want to do is keep producing, right? You're going to keep producing. So what I'm going to do is, let's use black here. And if we started out at Q1, right, we're going to want to push up. So here's our force, right? We essentially, we know we're underperforming, we're smart, we're going to get smart, we're going to increase production to get to this point, right? Because again, here, our marginal revenue is greater than our marginal cost. So we're going to keep producing, keep producing, keep producing. Okay, now let's say we're at Q2, right? Here we're overproducing. We're going to want to cut back because once we get above this point, right, our marginal costs are greater than our marginal revenue. So it just, this is really overkill, but this is to remind you at Q1, right, marginal revenue is greater than your marginal cost, and over here, right, your marginal revenue is actually smaller than your marginal cost. So let me go ahead and put a force arrow in here. All right, you're going to want to go back. All right, so you're going to want to cut production. So here you're going to increase production if you're at Q1. All right, if you're up here at Q2, all right, you're going to want to cut back and get to that sweet spot. Okay, all right. So one of the things to keep in mind, and by the way, your table here kind of shows you that. So let's say, just for argument's sake, at Q2 this would have been 8. Looking at your table, you're going to want to cut back, right? Because this sweet spot would be 7, right? And let's say Q2 would be let's say it's 2, right? And you're only getting a profit per unit of 4, you're going to want to push up to the point where you get here, right? So, you know, follow your force, right? Your pressure, right, to get back to the place where you would be. Now, remember, you're in a competitive market, so you're just taking the price, all right? You're just getting to the point where you think you need to be, right? Okay, so you want to get to this dotted line, okay? Now, with that said, all right, if we just follow these 3 basic rules, and we kind of have them on the board, so maybe I'll just polish them up a little bit. All right, so let's say this is rule number one, where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, right? You're going to increase production. I know this is kind of making this chart a little busy, all right? But let's say this is rule number 2, right, where your marginal revenue is less than your marginal cost. You're going to reduce production. You're not going to stop, you're just going to reduce production. Okay, it's an N. There we go. All right. Okay. And let's say you're here. This is rule 3, where essentially, let's just kind of fill this in, all right, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? Oh, let's just say production, and abbreviate here, stays constant, right? So essentially that would be rule 3. So I'll go over it here real quick again for you. All right, so rule number 1, if your marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, increase production. Rule number 2, right, if your marginal revenue is lower than your marginal cost, you're going to decrease production, right, forcing yourself back to Qmax, right, this magic point whereby the price line hits the marginal cost curve, right, which is your supply curve. Don't forget that, right? Okay, and the rule number 3 is essentially where your marginal revenue equals your marginal costs, and we just hold production where it is. Now remember, this is not, by the way, necessarily a point of equilibrium, okay? Because we're really looking just kind of at the one firm, and it's tempting to say, well, you know, Tudor, you just told me all these firms are in it, and there's no one firm that can really change the dynamics in the market because it's purely competitive. Yeah, I get that. But nonetheless, just kind of treat it as a one firm or deal, if you will. Okay, now if we were going to answer the following question, right, and this is probably one of the more important questions in this area. You know, how do you really know? I mean, it's an easy answer. It's a tough question to kind of sift through, maybe for no other reason than I kind of made this graph a little busy. But if the question becomes, how does an individual firm know how much to produce, right, into the market? Well, it's pretty much here. You just follow where you're going to hit your maximum revenue point, right? So it's really just your sweet spot. Okay, that's just your sweet spot, right? Now again, total revenue, sure, is going to be proportionate to how much you sell, all right? But again, if you start bringing costs into it, remember total revenue is just P times Q, price times quantity. There's no cost in there, right? Well, we threw in a marginal cost curve to kind of serve as a constraint to know exactly where that sweet spot ought to be, and it's right there. So basically, how much you know, how much do you supply to the market, right where Qmax is, right where that sweet spot might be. Okay, now with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to move the price line. I'm going to have to erase all this because I made it probably busier than I should have. So let's go ahead and maybe change, get some of the stuff off here. I don't know if I had used as many colors before on a graph yet this term. You'd probably tell me. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to where we were. All right, and maybe we'll just call this one price. But basically, it's costs and revenues again up here on your y-axis. All right, so maybe we'll just call price this time. All right, and this is still quantity. All right, put our origin back. Okay, now let's go with our, again, it's supposed to be a straight line. It doesn't turn out that way. Let's go with a little bit of red here. All right, so let's make that your average total cost, average variable cost. Well, maybe we'll leave the average fixed cost curve off of this one. Okay, now let me use green here. Do a little better on that. Okay, and I'm just going to come over here. Just remind ourselves that average revenue equals marginal revenue equals price. Okay, a better P there. Okay, and we're going to call this price line number 1. Okay. Now let's say, however, let's go with dark brown. Let's go ahead and move it a little bit. we're going to move it upwards. Let me move it up a little higher than that. All right, and we're going to call this Qmax 2. Let me go ahead and finish this one. I probably should have put that up there. Qmax 1, and let's call it Qmax 2. Okay, now let me go ahead and finish this one out here. So even though we're moving the price line, we're going to call this price line 2, right? Okay, and again, average revenue equals marginal revenue, excuse me, equals price. Okay, now, the dynamics and essentially what we're talking about here really doesn't change a whole lot. All right, all we really did was just increase. In fact, maybe just for dramatic effect, let me go ahead and give you some force arrows. All right, we just increased, all right, the price. Maybe the market shifted, right? But all producers, right? All sellers are going to be in the same spot. So it's not just the one particular firm, but all firms, again, are still price takers. We just went ahead and raised the price, right? So maybe we went from $6 a gallon to $8. And I know admittedly that's some pretty expensive milk by today's standards, but let's just go with the example. All right, but so let's say this gap is essentially $2 per gallon. All we did is just move the price line. Notice we didn't move the marginal cost curve. So in other words, notice we did not move the supply curve. Didn't touch it, didn't move it, didn't do anything with it. All right, just kind of kept it where it is. So Qmax 2, this is essentially the new dynamic. All right, so for instance, I won't take this too far, but let's say, for instance, even after we move the line, right, you find out that you're producing there, you'd want to cut back, right? Your force would be that way. Let's say you found out you're producing here, right? Or even here, let's say at old Qmax, just for the heck of it, all right? Well, then you're going to want to increase your production, right? Because at this point, assuming, right, we're at the new Qmax 2 point, we've moved things up. Even at this point, right, your marginal revenue would be greater than your marginal cost. Up here at this point, right, marginal revenue would be less than marginal cost, right? So you'd want to get right back smack somewhere at that point. So your force would be there. So essentially, excuse me, even if the price line moves, the dynamics are pretty much the same. You follow the 3 basic rules, right? And if you hit it here, you just maintain production. Production would stay constant. You really wouldn't have to do a whole lot, right? There's kind of, the funny thing is about, when you're